Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Rich Lowry.
Great.
Good morning, everyone. Are we ready for the last day of our Idea Summit? Yeah? Everyone having a good time? We're going to be joined this morning by Michael Knowles. Now, a lot of people and organizations who are successful at new media, they're spun off into a different planet. They might be cynical, they might be malicious, they might, in their defense, be genuinely insane. But the Daily Wire has figured it out, is enormously impactful and committed to the truth and conservative ideas. Michael Knowles is a huge success, very thoughtful, very insightful, and a lot of fun. Please welcome Michael Knowles.
Thank you very much. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks so much for being here.
You. No, thank you.
So I'm in Michael's personal debt because unprompted, when I had my little absurd cancellation controversy last year, he came to my defense, which I appreciate very much.
I mentioned to Rich, even if he had done something wrong, I would have defended him just out of a kind of personal loyalty. But that was the most preposterous attempted cancellation I have ever seen. And I do think it's a sign of the times, though. 10 years ago, you know, if someone sneezed the wrong way and the media didn't like you, your career was over, your family would be taken from you. And these days, I think with the shifting of the media landscape, shifting of the political landscape, it doesn't work anymore.
Yeah, I need to step up my game and resolve next time to be canceled for something I actually said. Right? So I was just dipping my toe in the waters of the cancellation game. Michael, by the way, had a brilliant insight several years ago that the hardest thing about writing a book is the words, getting the words on a page. So his first runaway bestseller actually had no words for 260 pages.
Roger Kimball, in his review of my magnum opus, Reasons to Vote for Democrats, all blank pages, he pointed out that I think it was Baudrillard wanted to write a book without any words in it, and I have finally, a book about nothing, and I've finally succeeded in his desire. You know.
All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about, we'll end up going further afield, but we're going to talk a little bit about academia and Bill's classic book that launched his career and arguably the modern conservative movement, God and Man at Yale. This is a book you care a lot about, you've engaged with very deeply, you've written a foreword to an edition of it. So what brought you to God and Man and Yale? What interested you in this book?
I first read God and Man at Yale, I think my freshman year of college. I went to Yale, you know, and somehow made it out alive. And you know, the great thing about Yale, I make fun of Yale, but really love the place because for most people who go, they become just fashionably liberal and have difficult lives because of it. But for those of us who resist the mainstream there, we become downright reactionary. We begin to question everything. And so being in such a liberal environment, such an atheistic environment, such a decadent environment, it actually really forces you to hone your views. And so it's a great opportunity. It clearly did that for Buckley. And I was a big Bill Buckley fan, National Review fan, and so I read it, and I thought, oh, this is really good stuff. But what is so surprising about the book from our perspective today is we're so familiar with conservatives in the year of our Lord 2025, certainly for the last 10 years, defending academic freedom. We say, you know, these campuses, they're censoring people, and we need absolute free speech and the free exchange of ideas, and these liberals, they're not defending academic freedom. But of course, Buckley did not defend academic freedom. And the subtitle of God and Man at Yale is The Superstitions of Academic Freedom. The whole book is an invective against what we would now call academic freedom, which, not to put too fine a point on it, he describes as a hoax. And he ultimately, in a form of academic freedom that he might embrace, he describes it not as the freedom from censorship, but the freedom to censor, the freedom of all of us to censor what is promoted at the universities and the kind of education that young people will get. Quite a shift, you know, and I think it opens us up to the charge that is sometimes made against conservatives, that all we ever conserve is what the Democrats wanted 15 years ago. Well, on this point, I think that our critics have a point, because if you read Buckley in his own words, I think it causes a lot of modern conservatives to clutch their pearls.
So it's also extraordinary that what he's complaining about, and this is connected to the point you're just making, what he's complaining about is the faculty aren't doing enough to promote Christianity in free markets.
Yeah, that's right. He says that there's a big battle going on in the world between Christianity and atheism. Obviously, he's writing as the Cold War is really reaching a fever pitch. And he says that there's another battle taking place at another level, which is the battle between individualism, by which he meant, and later would clarify, conservatism, and collectivism. And he says, these Yale professors, what's the matter with them? It's just like any conservative who's ever been to any university, really, in America, with perhaps the exception of Hillsdale and Ave Maria, says, what's the matter with all these liberal professors? They're pushing all of these crazy ideas, atheism, communism, extreme forms of liberalism. And he says, we need to stop that. We need to recognize that universities, by their very nature, teach certain things to the exclusion of other things, namely that which contradicts the first things. At the very least, a university has to abide by Aristotle's law of non-contradiction. And so if the university has to promote something, Buckley thought it would be better to promote Christianity and free markets than it would be to promote communism and atheism. And he has a wonderful line in there. He says, and he said it more eloquently than I will paraphrase it. He says, in the final count, academic freedom does not mean, has never meant, and cannot possibly mean what the liberals are saying that it means. He says these Yale professors can't even possibly believe what they're saying about academic freedom because, now these are my words, there are only so many hours in a day. There are only so many books you can read in a semester. There are only so many ideas that can be taught, and he quotes a president of Yale by the end of the book. He says, one can keep an open mind, but skepticism has utility only when it leads to conviction.
So you can see, though, I forget there's a professor in particular that he focused on as an example of what he thought was the intellectual rot. And it was relatively mild, some Keynesianism had seeped in. But then again, there was a critique of Western civilization that you could see in a very infant form. But you can look back at what Bill was complaining about, and even though everything you say is right about he wasn't defending free speech the way we are on college campuses now, et cetera, but you could see the seed of what would eventually grow to take over and poison all of academia.
Without question. And he hits a few different professors and even hypothetical professors. So in a simple, straightforward way, he says, no one really believes that the Yale sociology department would hire someone who extols the inherent superiority of the Aryan in anthropology, and Yale would never hire that person. Yale should not hire that person. Buckley later reiterated this point years later on a great episode of Firing Line, McCarthyism, Past, Present, and Future, which scandalized people who didn't want it to have a future. And he said to Leo Chern, who advocated the open society, he said, I don't want society to be more open. I'm an epistemological optimist. I think we can make certain exclusions, and I don't think we need to particularly protect the liberties of a Nazi or of a communist. And so you see that already in God and Man at Yale, written obviously much earlier. But he even dings the English department. He says, the English department would never hire a professor who promotes the poetry of Joyce Kilmer. And most people forget Joyce Kilmer now. There's a famous song from the 1940s that came out based on a Kilmer poem, which I actually like. Maybe it means I have bad taste. But he says, I think that I should never see a poem lovely as a tree whose hungry mouth is pressed. It goes on. And it's not Shakespeare, okay? It's not Keats. However, he says, the Yale English department would never hire a Joyce Kilmer scholar, for their faculty. So obviously we have standards, obviously we have norms, obviously we're promoting something. And if we don't fix this problem soon, the campuses are going to rot away. And to your point, Rich, that's exactly what's happened.
Yeah. So some things have changed, though, and arguably for the better, right, Michael? So it used to be that on elite college campuses, the hostility towards the Jews was coming from a WASP establishment. And now the sources of anti-Semitism on campus have become so much more diverse,
Yeah.
right? And you say DEI
Including
doesn't
Jews,
work.
actually.
Yeah,
That's true. Who says there isn't progress?
Right,
Now we
exactly.
have an eclectic coalition of people to chase the Jews around on Columbia's campus or something.
so on a lot of, or at least some of what we're arguing about on campus in terms of education, you don't need to reach, the tension between Bill's view of academic freedom and ours. The fact is, public universities and colleges are functions of the government. They're funded by the taxpayer. Someone has to run them. Someone has to decide what the curricula is. And the attitude of the educational establishment has been, you fund us, but you have nothing to do with what we do, right? We just go ahead. And Ron DeSantis, whom we're going to hear from later, is really a pioneer in this respect. Okay, you're a taxpayer-funded institution. The taxpayers are going to have something to say about how you do your business. We're going to have Western civ classes, et cetera. So it's kind of shocking. You should not have any woke public university in a red state in America.
Of course.
That's just something that shouldn't happen.
And that view, when Buckley articulated that view in Game, he was called an authoritarian, a fascist, a Nazi by all these people, including McGeorge Bundy famously. But what's funny about his view is it wasn't a novelty. This observation that these are public institutions and they receive public funding, and don't we have a right to control some of the public funding? Buckley's argument in God and Man at Yale was that the trustees, the parents and the trustees, need to flex their muscles a little bit and rein in these lunatics, these professors who, whatever right they might have to study what they please, they don't have a right to indoctrinate students into their crazy theories. That view is the traditional view of academic freedom. Our notion of academic freedom, just a quick little survey through about 850 years of intellectual history, it goes back to Frederick Barbarossa, Holy Roman Emperor, and the Privilegium Scholasticum, which said that scholars had rights similar to the clergy, not to throw around any crazy idea they wanted or to teach any crazy idea they wanted, but to censor themselves, that the scholars, in concert with the ecclesiastical authorities, could set certain standards for what would become the medieval universities. And sometimes this limited good views. The University of Paris ended up banning Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas, which is generally a bad idea. That should never be on a banned books list. But they fixed that, in any case, later on. That's part of the reason that they were taken off. And it wasn't just the Catholics. The Protestants had an experiment in academic freedom, University of Leiden in 1575, something like that. And that didn't survive the Synod of Dort, which was trying to counter the Arminian heresy, and so restricted academic freedom there. Some of the universities tried. That did not survive Napoleon. Harvard was founded. The one good thing I can say about Harvard is it was founded to combat the antinomian heresy of Anne Hutchinson. And even in 1940, so now we're talking right before Buckley writes God and Man at Yale. 1940, the American Association of University Professors issues a statement. It's a reiteration of earlier statements on academic freedom. And even at this great moment, the beginning of modern academic freedom, they say that professors should avoid discussing topics that are irrelevant to their subject matter in the classroom. They should certainly avoid doing it in an offensive way. And for all matters that they discuss, they should exercise appropriate restraint. That's the big defense of academic freedom from the university professors. So clearly something broke in the intervening years. And now we have the mess of the universities as we know them today.
So you mentioned that charge of fascism, and this is something we were talking about in our live edition of The Editors last night. I'm curious to get your take on it. So Bill's being called a fascist, I don't know, 1949 at Yale. And World War II had just ended. So this is literally a phenomenon that we've had for 50 or 60 years, 70 years. Elon Musk, right? The Teslas are being defaced with swastikas painted on them. What is it about the left that is so attracted to this charge, right? Barack Obama once and said remarks about Rahm Emanuel. Rahm Emanuel's so fond of giving people the finger that when he was a kid, he lost part of his middle finger and he was rendered practically mute. So I think in a similar way, if you told the left you can't call people you disagree with Nazis or fascists, they'd have no other way to express their argument that they're bad. It's the only thing they have.
Right. I think in part, in their defense, in defense of the people calling us all Nazis and fascists, they have no other way of understanding politics beyond the vague impulse to maximize individual autonomy. It is ironic because the consequence of their policies often shrinks our individual autonomy, certainly our ability to do good things. It grows our ability to abuse our freedom, but it doesn't allow us to exercise our freedom appropriately. But I think that's what they believe, and from this we see any number of modern political pathologies, the gender ideology, the open border, the decadence and degeneracy on campus, you name it. And Buckley really was telling them, no, you have to rein it in a little bit, guys. So for them, they say, well, anytime you tell us that we can't pursue some disordered appetite of ours, they'll, you're basically
so that's
Hitler
a form
reincarnate.
of constraint and therefore a form of authoritarianism.
Correct. And actually the right sometimes engages in this too, because we'll call the left fascists. And it bothers me, not because the left doesn't deserve our invective and biting insults, but because it's an imprecise insult. The left, when they go to their extremes, they're generally not fascists. They're communists. They will in fact tell us they're communists. They will join the Democratic Socialists of America. Some of them will be anarchists. But we don't lob that charge. It doesn't carry the same weight. And I think it's because in the contemporary mythos of our liberal society, the worst thing one can possibly be is a fascist, or Hitler, I guess, would be just the most extreme version of that. And so it's just become a synonym for bad. But these people aren't comparable to Hitler, and so I think we have to just re-examine, and I actually think that re-examination is happening right now at the level of politics and pop culture. What exactly do we mean by good and bad, if not individual autonomy, which reaches its apotheosis in the gender ideology, which has been rejected now at the ballot box? If not individual autonomy, what is the basis for our understanding of political good?
Mm-hmm. Let's stick with the gender ideology just for a second. So you'd say definitely we're winning the trans argument now? And
without question.
Yeah, and how's that happened?
So the left, many on the left don't want to admit how significant the trans ideology was in the 2024 election. It was hugely significant. And many voters were not even totally aware of it, because it falls under this bucket, which occasionally pops up on public opinion surveys, of common sense. What was so brilliant about the Republican focus on the trans ideology, you think about this, even Senator Cruz down in Texas was facing a little bit of a tough race against Colin Allred. He then ran an advertisement of Allred, a former football player, tackling a little girl in a football game, because Allred had defended men and women's sports, taking their trophies, beating them up, all sorts of nasty things. And the race totally turned around back in Senator Cruz's direction. So we have pretty hard data that this worked. And I think what it comes down to is, if someone comes on stage and starts talking about tariffs, I don't really know all that much about tariff. Maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong. Someone comes on stage, starts talking about our policy in Syria. I don't know anything about the Alawites. Maybe he's right. But if someone comes on stage and has a big burly fella next to him, a big chiseled jawline and big beard, and he says, that person is a woman, and you must call that person a woman. Every single person, I don't care how little attention you pay to politics, every person knows that isn't true. Mm-hmm. And so if the person who makes that claim is a Democrat and says, and by the way, you got to vote for me, here's my economic and social and this, that, and the other agenda, we know right off the bat this person's judgment is impaired, is not to be trusted. If I can't trust them on knowing the difference between a boy and a girl, why would I trust them with my tax dollars? Mm-hmm. Why would I trust them with my national security? It's completely absurd. So they've lost it. And I'm actually quite hopeful. We've all lived in a short span of time from a period in which the major Democrat nominees for president campaigned on marriage as a sacred union between a man and a woman, to the White House being lit up in rainbow colors and trying to trans little kids. It wasn't all that long ago that Bill Clinton said the era of big government is over, and has a sister soldier moment and turns against the excesses of his party. Now, all hell has broken loose. I think that we'll be revisiting questions of marriage, questions of so-called sexual rights. I think we'll be revisiting the excesses of feminism. And the reason for that is I can see the inexorable logic, or perhaps illogic, going from feminism, second wave, 1970s feminism says a woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle, men and women are practically the same, to the LGBT movement, which says men and women are practically the same, to the redefinition of marriage, which says, well, if men and women are practically the same, then two fellas and two ladies is the same as a man and a woman. To transgenderism, if men and women are practically the same, one obviously can become the other, they're the same already. To, well, if that's how human nature works and a man can really be a woman, it's just as true for a 5-year-old as it is for a 50-year-old. I see the logic going in that direction inexorably. So when you start to pull on that thread, and you realize that one is, I think one starts to turn back.
So I'd make that connection, and I think it is a powerful one in slightly different way to illustrate why they couldn't just look at the polling and say, what they'll say in their defense sometimes now is, look, it's just, there's only one trans athlete in the state of Maine or whatever it is. But to look at the polling and look at the very, very small number of people affected and just say, we'll just give up on this one. We'll fight on the stuff we're better on, right? But they couldn't do it because they think this is an issue of good versus evil, because they interpret it as being just the latest part of this march of righteousness. It began with civil rights movement, which was genuinely righteous, but everything since then they've betrayed as a civil rights issue that therefore you can't retreat on. And the first sign, and they had a lot of success in this, maybe they had like a 50 or 60 year run with this, but the first time they really seemed to hit the wall or get a significant stumbling block was Latinx, right? So they thought you could have like 10 people in a room and come up with some crazy idea, or someone write a journal article in some feminist journal, and you can make that, give them about 5 years, and they'd make it a reality. Everyone we're pulling this back a little bit, but everyone who worked for a major corporation or a branch of government had pronouns, right, in their emails. And someone just came up with that idea that was just crazy 10 years ago, and they made it reality. So they thought they could do this on trans as well.
That, and the last thing you're forgetting in the emails is the declaration that one is standing on stolen land. Right. This is real. This from professors, politicians. Sometimes I go give a speech. The introductory remarks say we're standing on the land of the Ojibwe people, and we're all terrible colonizers.
The Comanches never did land dedications after they.
No, I noticed that. Hold on. Do we? Once we return it to the Comanche, do the Comanche have to return it to the Apache? I don't know. I'm not so sure. But these excesses just looked so absurd, and it gets back to an insight that the left used to have in spades that they totally lost, which is, I'll just pick a popular figure in leftist intellectual circles, Antonio Gramsci. Gramsci, an Italian communist, imprisoned by Mussolini. One of the better things Mussolini did. Mussolini did a lot of bad things. It was probably wise to imprison Gramsci. Although actually, no, maybe that was a mistake too, because...
You can see the headlines now. Knowles endorses Mussolini.
Only on this one weird thing. No, but actually, in retrospect, even that was a mistake from Mussolini, because it gave him the opportunity to write his prison notebooks, which have been hugely influential in leftist circles and in the American left, and which observed a totally true statement, which is that a revolution will not succeed if it does not have the common sense. If you lose the common sense, the Marxists in the early 20th century were wondering, why have our revolutions not worked? We go to the common people, we tell them that we're going to upend their whole way of life, take away everything they know and cherish, and we're going to replace it with our theories. And for some reason, they don't like us. And Gramsci says, no, you have to hold on to the common sense in order to convince people to give up their traditions and ways of life. The left lost it, they simply lost it. I think they lost it a long time ago, but for people who don't pay close attention, it was so clear with the Ojibwe land declarations and the she, him, they, my name is Legion for we are many pronoun statements, and of course transgenderism broadly. They just totally lost it. So can they regain it? I don't really see them doing that anytime soon. I don't know who the leader of the movement is on the left. I don't know really what they stand for other than nonsense, and I just don't see a political organizing principle. The days of Obama are over, which means, talking about pulling on that thread a little bit, we now have a great opportunity before us. I think we've got a little bit of runway. Never underestimate the ability of conservatives to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory, but I don't know, we do seem to have a little bit of runway to regain some ground that we've lost.
Yeah, so a reminder, we have no cards on the tables. We're gonna go to questions in a couple minutes. If you have questions, jot them down, we'll try to get to them. So let's talk a little bit about the media environment. So a lot of great things and satisfying things have happened the last 2 months, right? We have this anti-DEI executive order that's going to be significant, rolling all back this nonsense in the federal government, and then also maybe in the private sector more widely, starting with federal contractors. We have the border totally shut down at the moment. We have deportations going, and perhaps the happiest event, we have Joy Reid out of primetime TV. So this just seems part of a trend, though, where we've seen it with Meta. All of a sudden Meta's like, we're going to have the X standard for how we do moderation, to a number of people who've been ousted from media purchase, who were, Joy Reid was just, it was the dumbest show on television, which is, I don't know, The View, what was dumber?
No,
I don't know.
Joy Reid, without question. I'm just glad that my doppelganger, Rachel Maddow, has not been booted yet from MSNBC. Though if she ever is, I want that time slot. If any executives are I want that slot.
We're never going to be able to unsee that now.
Especially the glasses really add something.
So with Meta, for instance, like a lot of people ding Zuckerberg for being an opportunist with this, but my view is, with him and some others, is he never wanted to be woke or run a censorship machine. He actually gave a good speech at Georgetown, was it 19 or something, or about how he wanted a free speech standard, but then was kind of bludgeoned into it by social pressure from the elites and then actual pressure from the government. So he figured, well, this is just the path of least resistance, to just be left alone and to run my business. And now he's woken up and actually, if that pressure's gone, I'll just run my business. Thank you very much.
Yes, and so one has to be a little bit fair to Zuckerberg, because the Elizabeth Warrens of the world were kind of breathing down his neck, I think. And now he sees which way the wind is blowing. It was a delightful scene at Trump's inauguration to see Bezos, Sundar Pichai, Zuckerberg, Elon, we already knew was on the team, all standing there, kissing the ring of the new president, because they recognize that there could be serious consequences. This is true throughout corporate America. You're seeing the dismantling of the DEI structure. Certainly, actually, I think it's probably going faster in corporate America than it is in the government, because they recognize Trump won not only the Electoral College vote, but the popular vote. Something's really, really broken here. You're seeing the bankrupting of San Francisco Pride. San Francisco Pride, the epicenter of all of the Pride festivities. They can't raise money this year. Longtime corporate sponsors are giving the excuse that they just don't have the money this year. The recession hasn't hit yet. That's a pretty weak excuse. It's clear it's political pressure, and which is good. We don't need these kinds of degenerate displays on Main Street when grannies and little kids are walking around. That's a big shift back as well. And
do they have kids in San Francisco?
Yeah, I don't. Are kids even allowed in San Francisco? Well, they certainly shouldn't be. What we're seeing here is a popular revolt, but we are also seeing the fruits of a government that is willing to use a little bit of power. Nobody wants a tyranny, nobody wants unchecked power, but for so long it seemed as though we would elect Republicans on occasion, and then the Republicans would refuse to use the power that the people had legitimately given them because of the hypothetical fear of what the liberals might do in the future. You know, if we wield just power today, why then the liberals might use unjust power in the future? I thought, I'm not concerned about that hypothetical issue. They've already been doing it to me for years and decades, actually. So, you know, let's get with the program. And Trump, being a little bit more of a blunt force in politics, I think he's made it clear that he is willing to, you know, repay some grievances that
you
have.
think?
Yeah, you know, I'm trying to think of the most diplomatic way to put it for a brash billionaire New Yorker who speaks in blunt ways. You know, Trump's doing that has really opened us up a little bit. It's reminded corporate America and the cultural left, you can't push us around forever and just always get away with it. On occasion, we're going to push back.
All right, so on that note, let's see if we have some questions. Do we have questions?
Yes, we do, Rich.
All right, we have questions.
So the first question goes to what Michael was saying about the universities. Is the tide turning? Alex Karp, who's the Palantir CEO, his new book calls for universities to instill virtue, or at least a calling to something greater than the self in students. Is this enough?
It's a good start. Is the tide turning? Yes. Some of the excesses, the Hamas demonstrations and the you know, kind of sexual displays and all, Antifa running amok, I think that is going to be diminished. But is it enough? No. Here I think we need to look back a little further, even back past William F. Buckley Jr. and God and Man at Yale, going back to St. John Henry Newman, the idea of the university. A university that neglects theology cannot ultimately get to where it needs to go. You know, that's Newman's thesis in one of the best books ever written about the university. Because if the university is to be a truth-seeking institution, then we need to consider truth in all of its forms, not merely as diversity, but as university. You know, the notion that the various disciplines have something to say about each other and they kind of work in concert together. But if we cut that off before ultimate truth, you know, then we're going to be stuck at least with a little sliver of subjectivism in there. And once that little poison of subjectivism gets in, it poisons the whole plate. So, you know, there is a lot of room for improvement. However, the great American universities were founded as seminaries. The great European medieval universities were founded as largely religious institutions, and they will always have some kind of religion to them. It will either be you know, religion, as Thomas Aquinas defines it, is a habit of virtue that inclines the will to give to God what he deserves. It will either be good religion or bad religion, but there will be some kind of religion because, as Cardinal Manning points out, all human conflict ultimately is theological.
So let's say Harvard really gets the message, all right? And Donald Trump's throwing his weight around, and you were the next president of Harvard. What does it look like? Sketch out what your actual concrete vision would be for how you'd run a university.
Well, the first thing I would do is something that they just announced a few days ago, which is I would institute a remedial math course. I don't know if this was put out by the Harvard Crimson. Harvard University is instituting a remedial math course because the creme de la creme of American students can't do basic algebra. How did this happen? Well, the way Harvard's spinning it is they're saying that because of COVID, there was a learning loss, and the kids did. Seriously.
Why was there a learning loss during COVID, by the way?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Who's responsible for that one? Well, also, even beyond it, I understand why certain students around the country would show up to college less prepared than they ought to be. Last I checked, Harvard still has a pretty low acceptance rate. I think, couldn't they find the 6% of American high school students who know how to solve for X? You're telling me that because they were homeschooled on Zoom for a few years, they can't do a math discipline that they should have learned in 7th grade? That doesn't check out for me. What else happened around 2020? What happened around 2020 was Harvard ended the requirement for SAT and ACT in admissions. And they announced last year that they're going to reinstitute that requirement. They let the standards collapse. Mm-hmm. The first thing I would do is re-implement standards. That would be the word. I think this is, if the buzzword of the 2024 presidential election was common sense, I think the buzzword of what we're looking at forward is standards. So to first re-implement standards, you have to make sure that people are even in principle capable of doing the intellectual work of the university. Harvard neglected that, now they realize it's a problem. They already know that. Then I would re-implement standards within the classroom. Do you remember when Kristen Waggoner, who I believe will be at this summit, Kristen Waggoner showed up to Yale Law School a few years ago. Yale Law School, supposedly the most elite law school in the country. And these students screamed at her like banshees, yelling, well, because she's conservative and pro-life and all the rest of it. That should result in immediate expulsion from the school. No disciplinary actions of the like. I remember when I was a student at Yale, a Harvard man, Harvey Mansfield, showed up to give a talk on manliness, and my classmates behaved like absolute children. I mean, it was so ridiculous. You're talking about one of the great scholars in America. So anyway, the next thing I would do is implement basic standards in the classroom. Not talking about intellectual conformity. We're not even talking about books yet in the curricula. Just, you have to behave properly. Maybe you have to dress properly. Maybe you have to recognize that, the way that we behave is going to have implications for the way that we believe, the way that we think.
That's a very old insight.
A very old insight, a Catholic insight. Lex orandi, lex credendi, lex vivendi. Kind of basic stuff. And then the last thing that I would do, not the last thing, but the next thing I would do, and then we'll move on from there, is I would make sure that Harvard University starts persecuting the antinomian heresy again. It needs to get back to its roots. Now Harvard extols the antinomian heresy. No moral law whatsoever. So those would be the first 3 or 4 things I'd do.
Great, awesome. Other questions?
So, and I'll also just say as a plug, if you look at our book of essays out here, we've got some original Bill Buckley essays in there. He has a 1959 column called Why We Should Ban Sloppy Dress. I believe it's about Princeton, if I recall.
That checks out, yeah.
So, just a thought. The question is, from a cultural perspective, how would Buckley view Trump?
From a cultural perspective.
No, Rich, you're the one who knew him. I never met Bill Buckley. He was gone by the time I came around.
He would be somewhere between where George Will is and Victor Davis Hanson is, somewhere on that spectrum. I don't know where exactly.
That's a spectrum.
But we were discussing this a little before the session. I think the young Bill Buckley, who was a fierce defender of Joe McCarthy and said, let's not worry about his personal peccadillos. Let's not worry that he goes too far in various statements. Let's not worry that some of this stuff isn't literally true. We should take him seriously, but not literally. He is right about communism and its evil. He's right about the threat that it poses to our government through various forms of espionage, et cetera. And his enemies are our enemies, and they're evil. So he worked his way around to, later on, I think he regretted how foursquare his defense of McCarthy was, but I think that would be the early Buckley. I think the later Buckley, he wrote, as you cited, this Cigar Aficionado piece in 15, where he called Donald Trump all the names you would, a narcissist, et cetera. But, you can't know. Bill's such an idiosyncratic mind. You can't say where he'd be on anything, but obviously he would welcome the incredible progress we've made on very important things. And then, he'd be critical how excoriating or where he'd go up the DEF CON chart on various things. I think it's hard to say, but what do you think?
I basically agree with that. Young Buckley, for sure, would have had the red hat. Well, I don't know. He had very good hair. So, he was a good, well-dressed J-Press wasp. So I don't know that he would have worn the hat. But he I only
saw him wear sailing caps. So
maybe a MAGA sailing cap.
Yeah, there you go. I'm not sure how big the market is for that, but it's an interesting idea.
The other thing one has to remember, though, about the one time that Buckley really weighed in on Trump as a political figure is it was a different kind of Trump. Because Buckley died in 06, 07, something like that. So when Trump made motions to run in 2000 for the Reform Party nomination, He was a New York kind of Democrat. He was totally pro-abortion. He was just a different figure. He had his same character, and Buckley said, oh, he seems narcissistic. But I think something that I've come to appreciate, at least about Trump, is I think he's one of the least narcissistic politicians I've ever met, in that he jokes about it. Mm-hmm. Most of the politicians that I know have a false humility, which is really a form of pride. Not the ones I know personally, the ones that I know and I see on television. The ones I know personally are all great guys. But Trump doesn't have that. There was a great quote from Trump that clued me in on this. He was asked if he was going to have a beer. I forget if it was with the Irish PM or there was some reason they were asking Trump if he'd have a beer. And he said, me? No, I've never had a beer. I think I'm probably the only president in American history who's never had a beer. It's the one good thing you can say about me. Could you imagine if I drank? Oh, I'd be the worst. And I think that kind of cut through some of Trump's boastful phrases, which he usually makes with a little bit of a wink. He's got a lot of showbiz to them. And I think it reveals a deep humility, especially for a guy who has his name in gold letters on every building he can get his hands on. And so, tempering the one real personal problem Buckley had with Trump from afar, it seems to me the man would be quite pleased with what we've seen.
Yeah, so I had a meeting with Trump around the time of the Bud Light boycott, which, by the way, did not involve Molotov cocktails, right? We weren't shooting up 7-Eleven dealerships during that boycott. But I said, I think Bud Light's in a really bad place. You can go to the freezer and get actually a beer that's better. And he's like, wait, they taste different? I was like, well, that's a weird question. But then I realized he just never has a beer, so he doesn't know. But to this aspect of humility, and we should hesitate to use that word with Trump, but you get whatever that quality is that we're trying to describe. The McDonald's foray, and by the way, no hard evidence ever emerged that Kamala Harris had worked at McDonald's, right? And it never will. But he puts on the McDonald's apron, and he's not pretending like a typical politician, because he's got a suit on and his red tie, right? So he's still himself, but he's willing to have fun and kind of be mockable, and makes it work the way no other politician could, right? Because there's that sense of fun. The dance, like the YMCA dance. Yeah. One, it's not a dance because I can do it. All it is this. But no one else would do it. Consultants would say, one, this was a gay song, right? But they came up in the village. The village people is Greenwich Village, right? So we're not doing that. And you're not doing your dance because you look ridiculous. Or even putting a hat on. It used to be a cardinal rule of politics. Politicians don't wear hats, right? Because you look preposterous. Well, what is this signature thing? A hat. So it just,
and a really big, bulky kind of hat too. It's not even some fashionable Tom Ford hat.
Yeah.
Yes, he breaks those rules in a way that allows himself to be mocked and allows himself to be memed. Even now to the point that it is. If you liked Trump 10 years ago, you kind of had to whisper it. You didn't want to be expelled from school or fired from your job. Now you have high school football players doing the Trump dance in the end zone.
Yeah.
And wearing the MAGA hats.
Well, the memes, that he deports the Venezuelan gang members, and then you get the memes of him hanging out of the takeout counter at McDonald's, waving goodbye.
Adios.
So we have a minute and 47 seconds left. So do the best you can with this. I'm going to throw out a big question. What is America? So we talk a lot about 1776, but many of us enjoyed your fine cigars, your cigar company called Mayflower. Last night. So how deep does America go, and how much do we need to know about the history prior to our founders?
Rich, that was a very good question, and an even better plug of Mayflower cigars.
Look, I've been at this a long time, Mike.
Yes, despite my swarthy Italian complexion, on my father's side, my family comes in part from the Mayflower. And so I thought, okay, if we're going to make a patriotic brand, let's go back even further than the 1980s or the 1950s or 1776. Let's go back to the earliest days of America. And I think part of the conversation that's happening now is we're looking back even further, not merely to the philosophers of the Enlightenment, but to classical antiquity, to the great achievements of Western civilization. Conservatives today, unlike at various points in the past in America, are connecting our history, recognizing that long story. Our founding fathers certainly did this. They loved Cicero and the ancient Greeks, and they took a lot of inspiration. We've been a little bit more modern in recent years, so I like that. What is America? Another question that will come up: is America a place, or is America an idea, just merely floating in outer space? Is it Is it realistic or is it creedal or something? Well, I have to go back to good old Aristotle on this. And happily, we're all talking about Aristotle more than we used to. Because Aristotle recognizes that a virtue is a mean between two excesses. So the excess between prodigality and miserliness, that's kind of the amount of money you want to spend. And so what about America? Well, the mean between recognizing that America has a creedal aspect to it, we are human beings because we're incarnate creatures with a rational nature. So, obviously there's an idea that matters here, some ideas, but also we are incarnate creatures. We live in time and space, and our country is circumscribed by a border, at least in principle. These days it is again. And so it's both of those things. I think we're beginning to remember the political virtue of prudence. We've become, on the left and the right, we've become highly ideological in recent decades. Now we have a leader of the party who is not the most ideological man, and I think that's quite good, actually. A person for whom politics is primarily prudent, pragmatic, based on common sense, even a gut instinct. I think that's a wonderful way of viewing politics because it doesn't require us to have that one thesis on the back of a napkin that says this is what America is. It's kind of like Justice Potter Stewart. You know it when you see it, and that's how I think how a lot of people feel about America. That's how I feel, and as a result, I see potentially, I don't want to be too optimistic for a conservative conference. I see potentially a little bit of hope for the future.
All right. Well, this has been tremendous. Thank you, Michael Knowles.
Thank you very much, Rich.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.